Hi guys, Miss Yandell here. I hope you're having a really great week. So today we're going to try to do a little catching up here and work on the next movement in American literature, which is realism. So if you have a moment, go ahead and put me on pause and get your hand out so we can look at that together. As you can see, I'm not anywhere crazy. I'm in the office. It's been one of those hectic weeks. Anybody know what I'm talking about? So I haven't had an opportunity to even have a moment to sit down and do this video, let alone get it all worked out online for you. All right, well, realism, you can see, transpired 1850 to 1914, but more importantly for me is what realism brings. And when we interpret poetry and short stories, and when we look at them and we think, what is the point of view here? These particular studies, as you know, can inform our readings of literature. So let's go ahead and take a look, shall we? Okay, so with realism, it tells us the first thing is fidelity to actuality in its representation. So that sounds like a mouthful, la 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 la, in its representation, right? I mean, it makes you feel like you've got your mouth full of marbles or cotton balls. But what that means is fidelity is being true to something, right? To actuality in its representation. Remember how every movement is a reaction, usually in an opposing direction from the one that precedes it? Well, this one, and this first point here, tells us how they feel about romanticism. Remember that romanticism glamorizes. Well, they are trying to say here that in this movement, they do the best they can to be true to what is actual or actuality. So instead of glamorizing something, or instead of making it seem better than it was, or leaving certain details out, historically speaking, this movement is one that embraces just telling it like it is. Now, when I say that, just telling it like it is, I have no doubt that there are those of you already who are embracing this movement as one of your favorites, right? Because everybody needs a good friend who just tells it like it is. And by the way, as romantic as I am, I get accused a lot of telling it like it is, right? Okay, well anyway, moving on. The second note tells us this opposes idealism, which means that this is one of the major points with which it disagrees, and it goes a different direction than the previous movement. The next thing, I want you to read these next 2 points because I want to give you these notes. I find these to be very important. And in a regular classroom, we spend a lot of time on pragmatism, relativism, and pluralism. And so go ahead and make sure you get that in your notes, or at least just write down on your handout so you know the difference. These ideas, whether you embrace them or not, are ever present in society today, right? And in the thoughts of the people around us. There are a lot of people. I would say I'm very pragmatic a lot of times. When you write down pragmatism, I had an instructor at the University of Tulsa who actually is on this like international board of pragmatism. They have all these crazy academic organizations globally. It's really funny, and some people just are major players in that, but he was just astoundingly intelligent. And one of the things he said, what I love best about him was what he said. I'm about to tell you. I mean, this guy was so brilliant. He could have told us this big mouthful of information, but he said pragmatism in its essence is just means this. So put this in quotes, put this next part in quotes, okay? What's good for you is good for you. I know. He said this to us. What's good for you is good for you. And I was so thankful because I thought, okay, I get it. Pragmatism is really about doing what works in the circumstance, what works for you. And keep in mind this, because what works for you may not work for somebody else. One diet program for one person may be like uber awesome, but it may do nothing for somebody else, right? But if it's good for you, if it works for you, then do it. Now, the interesting thing here is they adopt this idea about everything, even spirituality. One of the things, Henry James was a writer. Do you guys remember his name? Well, his brother, William James, was a philosopher, and he did a lot of written work about pragmatism. And one of the things he said is, if religion works for you, then do it. But see, the little subtitle information here, or the text here that he's wanting to input is, if it doesn't work for you, then don't do it. So that may be controversial for some of you, but that's what pragmatism really is. If it takes something, a particular A, B, and C for you to get a mission accomplished, then that's great. If that doesn't work for somebody else, they may need something else. So this goes along with these other terms that we're going to cover in the next little bulleted point here. And it says the truth they seek to find and express is a relativistic or pluralistic truth. And out to the side, what I'd like you to write is that relativistic just means exactly what the root word there says. Everything is relative. So again, it kind of hand in hand goes with what we just talked about with pragmatism, is that everything's relative to the person, the time period, the place, the environment. And how many of you know there is some truth to this? No matter if you fully embrace it or not, you can definitely see how this works and how this applies to us in society today and to people around us, right? Well, pluralistic truth is saying there are multiple ways to truth. So pluralism means there's not just one path to truth. There are plural, multiple paths. And all of this kind of stems to me from the same kind of idea that what works for you, but don't impose, for instance, the idea that there's only one way to do something. There's only one way to skin a cat. Who made that up anyway? I'm not even sure who came up with that phrase and why, and I'm not sure that they shouldn't be in jail. You know what I mean? But you know what I mean. Okay. Well, anyway, sorry. I just had like the most awesome cinnamon roll and it has a lot of sugar. So it could get crazy here, folks. All right. The next note says they were believers in democracy. Now, hello, this is very similar to what we just read about transcendentalism and the Romantics, but their concern about democracy is a little different. Let's look at it. They were believers in democracy, and the materials they elect to describe are not the glamorous, not the ideal, but the common, the average, and the everyday. So what their focus was on was reality and what it was. Common people, common language. I think that actually is said later on. They were considered realists and realism were considered the ultimate of middle-class art. The next note says it finds its subjects in the bourgeois life and manners. Now, you guys, I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but that's actually kind of a middle class. See, prior to this, it was primarily the upper class that they wrote about, that people were concerned about, they read about, they talked about. But here we see this shift to the more common, although I must say the bourgeois is middle class, and they are an empowered middle class. We're not talking necessarily about peasants, although you do start seeing more realistic characters be introduced, so to speak, in much of this material here. Okay, the next line says, center their attention on the immediate here and now. Bless my heart, does your handout still say her and now? So I guess the immediate her and now, right? The specific action and the verifiable consequences. So they're not into glamorizing or trying to recreate something that's the past, because ultimately, how do we know exactly what happened in the past? How can we be truly accurate about the past if we weren't there to see it ourselves? So, in this part of it, it talks about the here and now. They're concerned about it because that's what they're living and that's what they know about. The next part of this says they avoided traditional patterns of the novel because it lacked symmetry. Life lacked symmetry and plot. So they believed that it was really rather pointless to write perfect novels where there's everything just ties together, there's an ending, everything has been resolved, because they said that's not really realistic. So the important part here, everybody, is that we see this shift in what they're talking about. Even in the novels, they say, hey, life isn't like that. Life doesn't work out. It's not that simple sometimes. And you see them really focusing on actuality here, okay? So I don't know about you, but when I go to a movie and there are a lot of loose ends, or I read a book and I'm like, why didn't they finish that? Why don't we know what happened to so-and-so? I kind of get frustrated. But the truth is we don't always know the answers to every question we have. So help us God, right? So on the next page, if you're on your handout, take a look at this one. Fiction should concern itself with ethical issues. So here we see what becomes known as politicized writings and literature, where people start writing about social issues, political issues, controversial issues, ethical issues, moral issues, and they really use literature, as they do today, to push the envelope on certain topics or issues and concerns. And you see this all the time. I saw this on the Oscars. Did you guys watch the Oscars a week or so ago? Where they really pushed, the issue of, is the Oscars truly representing people, or is it biased still? Is it still racially biased? And that's a big, huge issue. Even the president of the Oscars said something about they're attempting to make it fair and level the playing field. And so, again, we see here this movement in play today where they're trying to say, hey, there should be equality here. What's going on is wrong. This is not okay. So the next one says the democratic attitudes of realists tended to make them value the individual highly. And here's the thing. The transcendentalists really valued the individual as well. But remember, with an idealism kind of at the heart of that, thinking about the breath of God in every person, seeing people as being uber valuable. But here, they just value the individual highly, and because of democracy, that we all should have a voice. So they kind of meet on this just for different reasons, and perhaps the people they're representing here are different as well, if you know what I mean. One's more an idealistic citizen, one's more a common citizen. Does that make sense? The next line, I think I said a minute ago, is you start to see, especially with Mark Twain, you see common men in common language. There's a short story that Mark Twain wrote that talks about a man that goes to a bar. It's called The Story of the Old Ram. It's one of my favorite Twain pieces. And one of the things I like so much about it is this short story he wrote about a man that goes to a bar and tells the story of the old ram. But the story is, you never find out exactly what the story is because he always gets drunk and passes out before the story ends. So I love this because I think it's so quintessential realism, because he's telling the story, but you never find out what it is. And he's in a bar and he's getting tanked, and the story gets longer and longer. It's really kind of funny, but very realistic. There's never an ending to the story. So the whole joke of it is you go hear the story of the old ram and you never hear the end of it or never know what happened. Okay, well, I've listed Twain there, Samuel Clemens, as an example of realism in American literature, and he is still seen as being one of the foremost voices of that time period. And as many of you know, if you've read some of his novels and young adult novels that he wrote, he was one of the first to be famous. People had written in dialect before, but he was famous for writing accurate dialect into his writing. And those of you who have read some of his stuff, sometimes it's hard to get into when you first start reading it because it's difficult. It's not standard English. But if you read it, he has a mastery with mimicking the ear of the language in accents. So, but Twain is the first one that academics noticed and embraced, because in realism they were more interested in how common people live and how common people speak. Okay, so does that make sense? I know this is a little bungled. I just got back from a lunch in Fort Smith, so I'm like, Anyway, I hope you have a wonderful week, everybody. It's always good to talk to you. Get this in when you can, probably by midweek next week. If you can't get it done this weekend, don't freak out. All right, stay cool. See you next time. Bye.